Welcome to our series on the Westminster Confession of Faith. We are glad that you are here. In the previous section, chapter 24, section 5, the confession taught that when adultery is committed after marriage, it is lawful for the innocent party to sue out a divorce, and after the divorce to marry another. Section 6 now completes the chapter. It steps back and asks a sober question. When, if ever, may the bond of marriage be dissolved? Westminster is realistic about the human heart, names the only two causes that are sufficient, and insists that such a weighty matter be handled in an orderly public way, not left to a person's private will. In this lesson, we will walk carefully through each of these points. Section 5 spoke of the innocent party and a lawful divorce after adultery. Section 6 widens the lens to the whole question of dissolving marriage. The confession begins not with a list of permissions, but with a warning about ourselves. The corruption of man is such that we are apt to stretch arguments unduly to put asunder what God has joined. So before Westminster names any ground for divorce, it guards against our eagerness to find one. Then it draws a narrow line. Nothing but adultery, or such willful desertion as cannot be remedied, is cause sufficient to dissolve the bond. And it adds a safeguard. The matter must follow a public and orderly course, and the persons involved are not left to be judges in their own case. Three things then: a warning about the heart, two narrow grounds, and an orderly process. We take them in turn. Let us now read the text of Westminster Confession, chapter 24, section 6. Although the corruption of man be such as is apt to study arguments unduly to put asunder those whom God hath joined together in marriage, yet nothing but adultery, or such willful desertion as can no way be remedied by the church or civil magistrate, is cause sufficient of dissolving the bond of marriage, wherein a public and orderly course of proceeding is to be observed, and the persons concerned in it not left to their own wills, and discretion in their own case. Notice where the confession starts. Before it allows anything, it warns us about ourselves. The corruption of man, it says, is such as is apt to study arguments unduly to put asunder those whom God hath joined together in marriage. That is a searching sentence. The problem is not only that marriages come under strain, it is that the sinful heart goes looking for an exit and is clever at finding excuses. Our Lord exposed the same thing. When the Pharisees pressed him about divorce, he answered that Moses, because of your hardness of heart, allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. Divorce was tolerated under the law as a restraint on hard hearts, never as God's design. Calvin observes that this permission was a concession to the people's stubbornness, not an approval of the thing itself. So Westminster makes us suspect our own reasoning. When we feel most justified in breaking a marriage, that is the very moment to remember how apt the heart is to study arguments unduly. Why is divorce so serious? Because of who joins a marriage together. When the Pharisees came looking for grounds, Jesus took them back behind Moses to creation. So they are no longer two but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. The marriage bond is not merely a contract that two people make, and may therefore unmake at will. It is a union that God himself forms, and what God has joined, man is not free to put asunder. Matthew Henry puts it plainly: those whom God has joined are joined for life, and no human power may dissolve that bond at pleasure. This is the ground on which the whole section stands. If marriage were only a human arrangement, then divorce would be a private decision. But because God is the one who makes two into one flesh, the breaking of marriage is never a small or private thing. It touches a bond that the Lord himself has tied. Now the confession draws its line, and it draws it narrowly. Nothing but adultery, it says, or such willful desertion as can no way be remedied by the church or civil magistrate, is cause sufficient of dissolving the bond of marriage. Hear that little word, nothing. Westminster does not give a long list of grounds for divorce. It gives two, and only two: adultery, and an irremediable, willful desertion. No other ground, however painful, is recognized in the confession as sufficient in itself to dissolve the bond. Yet hear that carefully. The confession narrows the grounds for divorce. It does not predecide every hard or dangerous situation a marriage may face. Such cases are not left to private reasoning, but belong under the confession's own orderly process to the Church's elders. And where there is real danger, God's wider call to protect life is not set aside while a case is weighed. Robert Shaw, in his exposition of the confession, notes that the Westminster divines deliberately confined the lawful causes of divorce to these two, drawn from the teaching of Christ and the Apostle Paul. This is meant to protect marriage from the very corruption named a moment ago. A heart apt to study arguments will always want the door opened wider. The confession holds it nearly shut, opening it only where God's own word has opened it. The first ground is adultery. When the bond of one flesh is violated by sexual unfaithfulness, our Lord himself grants an exception. He said, "Whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery." In the Sermon on the Mount he says the same. Everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. The plain sense is that adultery strikes at the very heart of the marriage covenant, the one-flesh union, and so it may be just cause for the innocent party to seek a divorce. We should weigh two things carefully here. First, the exception is for the innocent party. It is not a tool for the guilty to escape. Second, even where there is just cause, divorce is permitted, not commanded. Forgiveness and the healing of a marriage, where the offending party repents, is a high and Christ-like path, and many marriages wounded by unfaithfulness have been restored by grace. The confession names adultery as a sufficient ground. It does not make divorce the only or the noblest response to it. The second ground is willful desertion, and Westminster qualifies it with great care. Such willful desertion as can no way be remedied by the Church or civil magistrate. The Apostle Paul gives the principle. Writing to believers married to unbelievers, he says, "If the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so." In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. When a spouse willfully abandons the marriage and cannot be recovered, the deserted believer is not bound forever to a union the other has willfully and finally forsaken. But notice the guardrails the confession sets. It is willful desertion, a deliberate forsaking, not a temporary absence or an ordinary quarrel, and it must be such as can no way be remedied. Every lawful means of reconciliation through the counsel of the Church and even the help of the magistrate has been tried and has failed. Desertion is not a quick escape hatch. It is the last word after every effort to restore the marriage has been refused. Paul's own example is the departure of an unbelieving spouse, but the confession states the wider category of willful desertion that can no way be remedied, judged through the Church's orderly process. So this is not a rule for marriages to unbelievers only. Having named the two grounds, the confession adds a vital safeguard about how they are applied. There must be a public and orderly course of proceeding, and the persons concerned in it are not left to their own wills and discretion in their own case. In other words, no one is to be judge and jury of his own divorce. The matter is brought into the light before the Church and, where the law requires, before the civil magistrate, so that the cause may be tested and the bond not broken by mere private decision. This is wisdom, and it reaches back to the warning at the start of the section. Since the heart is apt to study arguments unduly, the confession refuses to leave the verdict to the very person whose heart is at stake. Even under the law of Moses, divorce was not a raw, private act. In Deuteronomy, a certificate had to be written and given, a regulated process, rather than a man simply turning his wife out. How much more should those who belong to Christ submit such a weighty matter to the orderly oversight of his Church? Put the section together, and you see both seriousness and mercy. It is serious because it refuses to multiply grounds for divorce. It pins them to the two that Christ and his apostle allow, and it keeps the whole matter under the Church's orderly care. It is merciful because it does not chain the innocent and the deserted to a covenant the other has gravely breached and refused to mend. The prophet Malachi warned that the man who divorces the wife he ought to love covers his garment with violence, and he called God's people not to be faithless. The confession breathes that same concern. It honors the permanence of marriage, restrains our corruption, protects the wronged, and points us toward reconciliation wherever it is possible. For most marriages, this section is a call to faithfulness and patient endurance, not a doorway out. And for those facing the hardest cases, it directs them not to their own private reasoning, but to the wisdom of Christ in His Word and the orderly care of His church. As we talk this section over, let its three movements guide us. First, the confession warns that the corruption of man is apt to study arguments unduly to break a marriage. How does that honest warning about our own hearts shape the way we think and counsel when a marriage is in trouble? Second, Westminster names only two grounds that are sufficient to dissolve the bond: adultery and irremediable willful desertion. Why is it a mercy and not a hardness that the confession keeps the grounds this narrow? And third, it insists on a public and orderly course of proceeding, so that no one is left to judge his own case. How does bringing these matters under the orderly care of the Church protect both the marriage and the people involved? Let us gather up the lesson, and with it the whole of chapter 24. Westminster Confession 24, section 6 teaches that, because the corruption of man is apt to stretch arguments to break a marriage, the bond God has joined may be dissolved by nothing but two causes: adultery and such willful desertion as can no way be remedied by the Church or the civil magistrate. And even then, the matter must follow a public and orderly course, with the persons involved not left to be judges in their own case. So chapter 24, having taught what marriage is, the purposes for which God ordained it, who may lawfully marry, and how the bond may and may not be broken, leaves us with a high and hopeful view of marriage, a lifelong, God-joined union, to be entered reverently, kept faithfully, and broken only where God's own word allows. Next, the confession turns to chapter 25, of the Church,